A Trip to Spiritland by Robert Benchley. In all the recent talk about spirits and spiritism, by recent I mean the past 350 years, I have maintained what amounts to a complete silence, chiefly because I've been eating crackers a great deal of the time and couldn't talk, but also because I saw no reason for my giving away those secrets of spirit communication which have, in my day, made me known from Maine to New Hampshire as the Goat of Ghosts. Now, however, I feel that society should know how it's being duped. Boop doopaduped, in fact. I first began my experiments with spiritism in 1909 while sitting in the dark with a young lady who later turned out to be not my wife. Watches with phosphorescent dials had just come into use, and I had one of the few in town. In fact, I had one of the few watches in town, most of the residents still sticking to the old-fashioned hourglass as being more handy. I just moved my watch up to my nose to take a look at it in the dark, as I realized that it was time to go Betty-by, when the young lady, seeing a phosphorescent blob of light make its way like a comet through the dark at her side, screamed, "There's a ghost in the room!" and fainted heavily. It was some time before I could get out from under her, and even more time before I realized what it was that had given her such a fright. But once it became clear to me, I knew that I had here the makings of a great little racket. So, stepping across her prostrate body, I went out into the world to become a medium, or in the technical language of the craft, a medium stout. Not many people realize how easy it is to fake spirit manifestations. For example, there was the famous case of one Dr. Raribaroo, well known in London during the first decade of the century as a highly successful medium and ear, nose, and throat man. He combined his medical practice with his occult powers by making spirits play tambourines in people's throats while he was working on them. This not only mystified his patients, but made them pretty irritable, so he had to give it up in the end and devoted all his time to seances. Dr. Raribaroo was famous for his flying leg trick or foot messages. This was a highly mystifying manifestation even to Dr. Raribaroo, although he knew exactly how it was done. The client was seated in a darkened room after having examined the medium to make sure that he was securely bound with surgeon's tape to his assistant, who was, in turn, chained to the wall of the room. The room was then hermetically sealed so that it got rather unbearable along about 4 o'clock. Having made sure that everything was shipshape, one of those old medieval prison ships you read about, the client sat in a chair and held fast onto the knee of Dr. Raribaroo. Sometimes they would sit this way for hours if Dr. Raribaroo happened to like the client. Otherwise, the seance would begin immediately with a message to the doctor from his control, an old Indian named Mike. Mike would tell the doctor that someone wanted to talk to the client, usually someone of whom the client had never heard, whereupon a ghostly leg would be seen flying through the air, delivering a smart kick with its foot to the side of the client's head. Almost simultaneously, a kick would be received on the other side of the head, which would pretty well rock the client groggy. His chair would then be pulled out from under him, and a pail of water be upset over his shoulders. At the same time, a spirit mandolin, suspended in midair, would play Ethelbert Nevin's Narcissus in double time, with not too expert fingering on the high notes. This astounded and bruised a number of clients, and the doctor's reputation grew apace. The funny part of it was that practically every client who was thus maltreated had no difficulty in recalling some deceased friend or relative who might be glad to treat him in this manner. They all took it for granted that they were getting only what was coming to them from someone who was dead. They would say, as they picked themselves up after the seance, "I guess that must have been Dolly," or "Sure, I know who that was, all right, it was Joe," all of which does not speak very well for human society as it is constituted today. Now, for the explanation of how this flying leg trick was done. It was one of my favorites when I was at the zenith of my powers. The medium is strapped, as we saw, by surgeon's tape to his assistant, who is in turn chained to the wall. When the lights are put out, the medium, using the one knee which is free from the grasp of the client, presses a concealed spring in the chair on which he is sitting, which releases the entire side of the room to which the assistant is chained. The assistant, with nothing to bother him now but the loose wall hanging to his wrists and the medium who's strapped to him, seizes an artificial leg which has been covered with phosphorescent paint and belabors the client with it, as we have seen. With one foot he releases a spring which pulls the chair out from under the victim, and with the other foot releases another spring which upsets the pail of water. By this time the client doesn't know or care much what's going on. Meanwhile, the medium, still strapped to the assistant, brings out a mandolin pick which he has concealed in his cheek and plays a phosphorescent mandolin which has been lowered by a second assistant from the ceiling to a point directly in front of his mouth. Narcissus calls for very little fretwork on the mandolin, being played mostly on the open strings, but what little fingering there is to be done is easily handled by the tip of the medium's nose, which he's trained especially for this work. You can do it yourself sometime, unless you happen to not like Narcissus as a tune. I myself got pretty darn sick of it after 5 or 6 years, which was one of the reasons I gave up holding seances. Another famous medium, whose fakes are now generally recognized, was Madame Wayhoo, an East Indian woman from New Bedford, Massachusetts, whose father was one of the old New Bedford whales. Her specialty was spirit writing, and her chief claim to integrity was that she herself could neither read nor write. As a matter of fact, she was a graduate of Radcliffe, according to the gossips. The person desirous of getting in touch with the deceased relatives would go into a darkened room and ask questions of Madame Wayhoo, such as, "Is it in the room? Is it animal, vegetable, or mineral? Did you file an income tax return in 1930? And if so, were you married or single at that time?" To these questions the medium would reply nothing, until the questioner got rather jittery as a result of sitting in a dark room and asking questions into the blackness with no replies. Just as some form of mental breakdown was about to take place, the medium would scratch on a slate with a slate pencil, at the revolting sound of which the client would leap into the air and rush from the room screaming. On returning, he or she would find that a message had been written on the slate, something like "out to lunch, back at 2:30, or a complete bowling score. I don't even have to explain how this was done. I have in my files hundreds of other explanations of psychic phenomena, but I'm saving them up for a debate. I also have some excellent rye whiskey, which I will let go for practically nothing to the right parties.